So sweet. Let me take the view off of myself here. I'd rather see all of you. Thank you. Thanks, Margie, for that introduction, for the tremendous impact you have on my daughter. You've had on my daughter, who is a natural leader, and a lot of that was affirmed and really came into being under Margie's mentorship. And as Margie mentioned, Bob was also really instrumental for starting Church of the Wild and helping me direct my discontent within the church toward what was rumbling beneath it. I had gotten to a place a place I would just call burnout, both within the environmental movement and within the church. And in the midst of that burnout, which I could talk about the whole time here, I bet a lot of us can relate to that from what I've heard about your community from Margie. But in the midst of that, I recognized, I felt myself being basically called into the wild. And spent a lot of time under those oak trees in Ojai, and started to explore different ways of connecting with wilderness. And I wasn't even really sure why at the time. Sort of my discontent within the church wasn't really about that necessarily, but it was something that emerged, that I was able to recognize that in both of these parts of my life, about 15 years as a pastor, and up until then, and then a dozen years in the youth climate movement. My son also went to Margie's school 4 years earlier, and he and I started a nonprofit organization called Kids versus Global Warming, or the I Matter Youth movement. And he needed to essentially quit school by 7th grade. If you've ever walked along the promenade at the beach in Ventura, there's a few, believe it or not, there's a few what we called SLAP poles, Sea Level Awareness Project poles, that we installed there, 15, 17 years ago. But Alex, my son's time at El Camino was also really influential. They had allowed him to really step into what he was passionate about, and it was his passion that drew us into the climate movement. He became 15, 17 years ago what Greta is now, and we spent all of his adolescence traveling around the country and Europe, where he spoke to over 1 million people around the climate crisis. Back then, there was no youth movement. And I can kind of feel, we did things like sue the government. We were the ones that first sued the government on behalf of youth about the climate crisis. We did youth marches in 200 cities and countries. We were very much immersed in that world, which also led to burnout as my years within the church as well. But what I found is underneath that, both from the environmental movement and from within the church, and in the church, I started, so this is like 33 years ago, I worked with World Vision, which is a relief and development organization, work with children all over the world. And I wrote a resource for churches called Let the Earth Be Glad. So this integration of our spirituality and the rest of the natural world has been there for a long time, sort of, but those parts of my life kept being separate. And so now I'm getting to my point about the burnout. At that point of that burnout, I found myself turning toward Earth herself. And I recognized what was missing really from both of these parts of my life, trying to do sustainability kinds of things within the church, as well as doing sort of like reconnecting us spiritually within the climate movement. What was missing was a deep connection with the land herself, with our place. And so that kind of started me on a trajectory where I did start Church of the Wild back in 2015, to develop practices that reconnect us with our kin, with the land, with the trees, with the stones, with the mountains, a spiritual connection that all of our ancestors had, all of them. For most of human history, human spirituality has been deeply connected with the rest of the natural world. And it's only been in the last few thousand years when civilization has, and empire and colonization has needed to disconnect people from their relationship with the land in order to own it, in order to control it. And so that methodology of our dominant system of othering others, of desacralizing others, both human as well as more than human. Our deep disconnection from the rest of the natural world is a species supremacy, very similar to the white supremacy that we are guilty of. And so I began to feel a reconnection with the sacred, with God, when I found myself in that place of wilderness. And I began to ask the questions of why, what is it that I started to investigate it, that I looked into, the Judeo-Christian stories, into both of the Testaments. And I literally went through the whole Bible going, oh my God, this is consistent throughout I think almost every single leader's story at a pivotal time in history, at a pivotal time in the world, and a pivotal time of the spiritual leader's own step into leadership. Every single one of them was called into the wilderness. And I was, more and more curious about that. And I kept leaning into that to understand what that was about. It had to be about something more than just sort of like what I used to preach it as, is a dark night of the soul. Used to be like the wilderness time, like something rough and difficult that was happening. But there had to be something more. And so I kept looking. What I found sort of in my own personal spirituality is that we are connected. It's like I knew this with my brain, but I didn't really feel it and live it, that we are connected, we are interconnected with everything. And not just physically, not just how, like we exhale CO2 and the trees exhale oxygen and that makes us stay alive, but that we're also connected emotionally and we're also connected spiritually to all beings, to all those humans across the world that we don't know personally, but we can feel them, like the whole service this morning, which, by the way, was so deeply meaningful. I felt myself silenced and wanting to sob. I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to say any words? So forgive me. I also woke up this morning with when you wake up and you have the remains of the emotions from a dream. And it was a dream, I still feel it. It was a dream of massive flooding, massive floodgates being opened. So that the worship music this morning was really resonating deep within me, and that hip hop music. Thank you for finding that and sharing that. Anyway, I'm really grateful also. I just want to say this too, that when Margie told me, or actually it was when David, you sent me the recording from last week, and I could see how the format of this community is defined by conversation. And conversation is really central to my reorientation to faith and to the land. And it's really at the core of all of my work now. And conversation is a word that really and a way of living that really restores an ancient meaning to the Latin word sermo, which means actually the opposite of a one-way sermon. It meant, when it was used up until like the 4th century, sermo meant a lively discourse. It meant like a dialogue, a manner of speaking back and forth, a conversation. It's a noun that's from the, I like to look at the meaning of words and the etymology of them. And conversation is created from this word, sero. Sero means to weave or to join. It's the intimate living of life together. And it's so cool to see that your community is built around this conversation. I feel like where we are in our world is going to take more than political and cultural. It's going to take more than the activism. It's going to take more than the best sermons in the world. It's going to take more than great campaigns. There's something deeply entrenched in our cultural dominant story that needs to change. And this is really the role of religion to reconnect us. Religios, another word. The word religion is religios. In Latin, it means like again. Ligios, like a ligament. It means reconnection. And yet religion is used so much for disconnection, isn't it? But when I listened to your powerful sermon last week, Pastor David, I see that you are living into the full meaning of religion, of reconnection. There's a quote that I love to refer to from Thomas Berry, evolutionary theologian Thomas Berry. He says, "We are in trouble because we don't have a good story. We're between stories. The old story," he says, "is no longer effective. We can see that all around us. And yet we've not really lived into the new story," which I believe is what we are, those of us on the edges here who are living into a new way of being human, a new way that is built in compassion and love, a new way that Jesus talked about. That's what we're here for. But Thomas Berry says that it's only by reconnecting, religios, reconnecting with the rest of the world, all the people that aren't like us, all the people that aren't in our community, that don't speak our language, all the people that aren't even human, as we reconnect with the rest of the world as a sacred relationship. He says it's only through that we can break through the impasse that we're in. He says we are only talking to ourselves. We're not talking to the rivers. We're not listening to the wind and the stars. We have broken the great conversation. And over the last 30 years, I've wrestled with this broken conversation as a pastor of indoor churches, as a climate activist, as a mother, and now as a guide who leads people into spiritual practices that reconnect us with the sacred that is in and between all things. It's an emergence of something, what I feel like the kind of work that I'm doing is part of something bigger that's emerging. I see it as within the church. I worked 30 years ago to help shift our theological focus from dominance to stewardship, to take care of creation and for sustainability, and that's part of what it means to be a person of faith. But stewardship in itself is sort of a species supremacy position. It's sort of saying that we have the answers and we can fix this, as if we were the ones, we are the species, like that prayer this morning, Kenichi, beautiful. It shows that we are the ones who created this problem. We are not going to be the ones to figure it out, I don't think, on our own. And so now I feel like our role as a spiritual community is to move, deepen in stewardship, but move into relationship, to relate to the rest of the living world with that respect and that love, to see others not as objects, but as sacred subjects, all others. And it's at that moment, at these pivotal times, that I'm just seeing it more. God calls people into the wilderness. God still calls people into the wilderness. You know, God revealed God's self to Moses, not in the tabernacle, but in a bush, in the wind, on the top of a mountain. And the enslaved people that are escaping from Egypt, they were sent into the wilderness, not the promised land, for 40 years. And I looked, and all of the, there's so many stories. It's like all of a sudden I could see, all of a sudden my eyes were clear and I could see, including Jesus and Paul and John the Baptist. They were all called into the wild, into the wilderness. And the wilderness, that's another word. It's used over 300 times in the Old Testament. And the Hebrew word is Bamidbar. And it's usually translated as wilderness. In fact, in the Old Testament, it's always translated as wilderness. But if you look it up in lexicon, you'll see that the very first meaning is not wilderness. The second meaning is wilderness. The very first meaning is mouth, the organ of speech, the organ which speaks. And to see wilderness as that place that speaks to us, it changes the whole story for me. You know, like, therefore I led them out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness, Bit Minbar. That means it's not simply this harsh backdrop for human drama, like I used to portray the site of the 40 years of Israel's wandering, but that the wilderness is a place that speaks plainly, that speaks of the voice of the sacred. And that changes the whole story. What if God knows that there's simply no better way to rehabilitate from the effects of trauma and enslavement than immersing into the wilderness? And seeing that the wilderness is an organ of speech as the part of the body of the living earth that speaks, that transforms it into a tender place of intimacy. You know, what if Moses and his traumatized people were sent into the wilderness, not as some kind of like mocking punishment for their complaining, which I used to always think, or some kind of intense object lesson, but what if the wilderness was instead a necessary place to listen to the sacred speaking through the voices of the burning bushes and calling humans to remember that they're part of a greater story, a greater interconnected story. Exodus says that the Israelites were captive under Egyptian colonization and enslavement for more than 400 years. You know, unlearning an identity of oppression and restoring a new character of belonging and purpose probably takes at least 40 years. And so rather than a punishment of being sent into the wilderness, it becomes a provision, an opportunity for listening and deepening relationship. Thomas Berry says the divine communicates to us primarily through the language of the natural world. Not to hear the natural world is to not hear the divine. And we're being invited back into that relationship with a beloved community larger than our species, back into the great conversation, listening to the land as a sacred voice and responding in kind. And the ancient Greeks called this kind of conversation logos. 500 years before Jesus, Heraclitus was the first one to use this word logos. And it meant a divine reason that was implicit in all the cosmos, that ordered it and gave it meaning and form, that connected all things. So logos is like this ancient description of what quantum scientists have discovered is actually at the center of all molecules, not things, but relationships. Relationships that are connected through various forms of conversation. And so a few centuries after the death of Jesus, the writer of the Gospel of John used this familiar concept of logos that people then understood was a form of conversation and interconnection. And he, I think, brilliantly saw that that was a culturally relevant way to understand the significance of Jesus in the context of the Christ. He said, and we're all familiar with this, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. This was in the beginning. This was with God in the beginning. All things came into being through this. And apart from this, nothing came into being that has come into being. And the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. Imagine that. In the beginning was the conversation, the connection, the connective tissue. In the beginning was the connective tissue with all, between all things. And the connective tissue, the conversation was with God. And the conversation was God. Kind of shifts everything. Logos has this relational force inherent in all things, holding together all things by relationship between. Logos was a good metaphor and a description for the Christ and for the role that Jesus fulfilled in embodying Christ, that existed before Jesus, before humans even. Logos is this force of emergence that takes the form of relationship through the dynamic of conversation. Logos is the dynamic of relationship. This act of conversing, this back and forth, this sensual living and flowing and being in relationship with one another. That makes sense to me. And it's not even a religious concept. It's this interconnected, interdependent relationship that we have with one another, with all people and all things and all beings. We get into trouble when we avoid and we destroy that relationality and we put barriers up and we other others. We're so othered from the rest of the natural world that we call it it. We call it natural resources as if they existed only for our gain. And up until the 4th century, all the translators that translated the Greek word logos into Latin, they all used the word sermo, which means conversation. Christ as conversation, as a radical solidarity, and a primal and ongoing relationship, a way that life works. It made me curious, though. Why is it that this translation, consistently translated for the first 3 centuries as sermo or conversation, cannot be found in any version of the New Testament you can read today? Rather than conversation, the passage that has been translated is the way we know it. In the beginning was the Word. And I just am proposing that it's been a long history of patriarchy and mistranslation and empire that has actively suppressed this translation for 1700 years. And I think reviving it is an act of resistance. Something happened in the 4th century that caused the patriarchs to stop translating logos as sermo and translating instead as a term verbum, which means word, a single vocable. I believe it was intentional and it was a political decision that went against the grammatical, the historical, and the contextual use of the word logos. And it matters. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine, he had an agenda. He had just decriminalized Christianity because it had won him a few battles and it helped him become the one emperor. He was able to murder the other 3 emperors. But he needed a religion that asserted the single ruling identity for the deity that would be helpful to remind folks that there was a new solo emperor too. Back then, there was a lot of conversation going on. A lot of people had different ideas of what this emergence of Jesus, of the Christ, meant for them. But those dissenting voices were shut down. For 60 years, there was a fight for dominance back then about who could understand the nouns of God, the hierarchy of God. And anyone who had a different opinion than the dominant ideas were excommunicated and exiled and even killed. And finally, there was, by the 4th century, an official and sanctioned version of the New Testament that was written, a lot of reasons it was written to end any dissenting voices. And in that, the decision was made to use the word verbum to translate logos from the opening hymn of John 1. That one single vocable, the smallest fragment of language, the one word. After all, conversation or sermo, if you use that to define the essence of Christ, that could encourage those dissenting voices to be heard. Imagine that. They had to be effectively shut down. Word was better, no back and forth, no room for dissent, no changes, just the one and only word, the last word, the capital W word, the inarguable word, the end of discussion word, the everybody else's word is heresy word, the hierarchy chooses word, and so it remains word. End of conversation. So restoring that original translation of logos has this potential to completely reframe how we understand our interactions with spirit, with ourselves, with our brothers and sisters throughout the world, and with nature herself. Imagine what that one word change could do. Imagine what could happen if this spirituality by the word of authorities was able to be transitioned into a spirituality guided by conversation with one another, conversation with all those voices that have been pushed outside, there's where the brilliance is that we need right now. All those voices that have been shut down. Voices from the Southern Hemisphere, voices from people of color, voices from the queer communities, voices from the land, from the trees themselves. Those are the voices where we're going to be able to hear the messages that are needed at this pivotal time. Imagine how different Christianity could be if it became a place for sacred conversation, a place to explore possibilities and express doubts and disagree and encourage voices on the edges. Imagine the church honoring sacred conversation by lifting the voices up that have been shut down by empire. Imagine the reconciling role that we, the church, could offer in bringing together opposing forces to remember that we are all interconnected. It is an radical act of resistance to a culture of separation, to reconnect with the land, to reconnect with other humans, not as a collection of objects, but as Thomas Berry says, as a communion of subjects. And that's where I see the shift is happening. It's only together, all of us together, listening to one another, the humans and the more than humans, as a collective and a compassionate whole, that we can live into the deepest definition of the kingdom of God, only without the G. A kingdom of relations that reframes a spiritual paradigm from a human kingdom paradigm of hierarchy and monarchy and inequality of power over, that privileges the few, to a kingdom of relational cooperation and kindness and compassion and sacred reciprocity. It's essential for us in these times to come and these times that we're in right now, that we're called to midwife our culture into an emerging new story of kingdom, a kingdom of God without the G. This kingdom is a practice, a conversation where all voices are welcome, where we love the neighbor, all of our neighbors, where we love neighbors, all neighbors, even those from different tribes and political parties and cultures and races and even different species. Love all neighbors as ourselves. And in this kingdom, we do unto others, all others, as we would have them do unto us. Thank you, and amen.
Victoria, wow, thank you. How rich is that, everybody? When um, both when Margie introduced in your introduction, and then you talked about religio, connecting, and then the remembering in your intro is hyphenated, remembering.
Mm.
And that's what you have been actively doing in these moments. And it made me think of the mythological king of Egypt, Osiris, who was cut up into pieces by his jealous son, and the pieces of his corpse were sent all around Egypt. And because of love, his wife Isis, who had been teaching women how to weave, his wife had all of the pieces brought back together because of love. That such intense love took what was irreparably cut up, divided, separated, distanced, took all of that and brought it back together again because of love. Do you see a reflection of what you're telling us in that story?
So good. Yes. Yes. I love how different cultures have different ways to wrap their, hearts around what is real. And so I love when there's different versions of the same story that emerge through different cultures throughout different times. Yeah. Beautiful.
Well, I know that there are other folks who are interested in this and are bubbling over with some kind of response or a thank you or something. So yeah, do that. The floor is open.
Good morning, Victoria, and thank you so much for being with us. I think I know I'm overwhelmed and blessed by what you shared, and I have a feeling that I'm not alone. I was reading, as random as this is, I was reading about May of 2018, and one of the articles of that month said new research shows plants talk to each other through their roots and the soil. And they actually did a study on this, and it was published in a journal called PLOS One. And you remind me of the Mother Teresa quote that what is wrong with the world is we have forgotten that we belong to each other. And so that whole idea of wilderness being the place that's peaceful, not wild as we would understand it, but that it's pulling us out of the wildness and reaffirming and having us come back to ourselves. So thank you so much. There's so much more, but I'm going to shut up and let other people talk.
Hi, I'm gonna say what Lisa said and loved what you had to loved everything you had to say. As a sort of side note, my husband and I are actually moving, and we have this big plan. We want to, whatever little patch of land we get, we want to try to rewild it, like create our own wilderness there.
Like Mary Reynolds. Have you seen her book, We Are the Ark?
No, but I'll look at it. And I've been following like some influencers on Instagram. You know, it's kind of a thing now. Like a lot of people don't have access to the wilderness, but they have the ability to bring back whatever wilderness was where they are now. So I just thought that was another little tweak to what you had to say. If you can't get to the wilderness, create it where you are.
I love that.
Michael has his hand up if you want to.
Michael, you're muted.
Lisa, thank you. You mentioned about the way plants have been known to communicate through their roots and physically. That triggered another memory and spiritual experience for me in which I thought of plants communicate with us through their scent and through their aroma. And I just thought, I know many of you like me find refuge in the wilderness of the mountains. And Sequoia and Yosemite are both really sacred to me. But as you go up in the car to the mountains, the first thing, you see visually the trees, but the first thing that stirs me, at least my emotions, brings me alive is the aroma of the trees, the aroma of the dirt and the trees. It's sacred, and it's the essential thing, you know, through our olfactory stuff. Just very quickly, I just wanted to share with Victoria. Thank you. It was so meaningful. I've shared, we all know each other so well in this community that I don't want to talk about it much, but the most spiritual, intense spiritual experience, body, mind, soul, smell, touch, God alive within me, was walking around at a pretty high elevation of Sequoia and encountering what looked like a river of very young fir trees. And I started to cry, and I still cry sometimes when I think about it. And not only were this just wonderful, I love trees, these wonderful trees, but they were innocent. They were children. They were children trees. And it's just, anyway, thank you. You evoked a lot. Thank you so much.
It's interesting. A lot of people have these stories, and we just haven't had that, you know, sort of like inner permission or cultural permission to share these as something spiritually meaningful. Thank you.
Judith.
I am so grateful I was able to be here because your book was transforming in my life. And I'm a minister, and we actually got a grant for doing a weekend of going wild.
Yay.
After all of us reading your book and deciding that we were going to take our whole community out in the wilderness together and have a weekend together of fires and hiking and forest medicine. And one of the things for me that is so healing, always been since I was a kid, is to just climb a tree, you know? And there's a lot of research now being done on the vibrational medicine of trees, where actually, if you ask a tree to send its medicine to you, that it will actually go to the parts of your body that need it most and send you energy. And so really, you have just brought so much to my life, and today was mind-blowing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, there's so much more I would want to say, but I'm going to ask Brigida.
Thank you for that wonderful message. And it occurred to me as you were talking that what you're saying is something that all of us innately know, but for some reason choose not to recognize or to focus on. And you know, it's like when you take children to the beach, they turn into different people. They're joyous and they're happy, and dogs are joyous and happy, and old people are joyous and happy, and everybody seems to feel it when they're in the mountains or when they're by a river or when they're, you know, anywhere outside. And I just wanted to share one thing that I really enjoy. I sleep every night with my window wide open, and many years ago, the thought came to me that when I feel a little breeze on my cheek, I always think it's God kissing me.
Beautiful. Beautiful. There was a survey, or like a report research done several years ago, and they asked, where do you experience the numinous the most? You know, the presence of the sacred the most. And for people who aren't connected with a religious tradition, like 76% of the people said it was in relationship with nature. And what was really interesting is that the people that were affiliated with churches and other religious institutions, 75% of the people said it was within nature. And yet we still, you know, sort of have this cultural idea that, you know, God is not a tree or whatever. And there's reasons behind that, which I think are also patriarchal and oppressive reasons to disconnect people from their place. There's colonizing reasons why we are disconnected. And so we deny what we know deep within us in order to just survive within an oppressive system. And so I think just honoring that and speaking of that and sharing that with one another and taking it seriously yourself is that pathway, you know, of that remembering ourselves back into sacred community.
Oh, well, let's let Jade be last among our contributors today,
But not least.
and not least.
Here's an immediate sharing with you about the healing powers of thinking about wilderness as a calming visit with the divine that we see in nature. I've never had high blood pressure in my entire life until a year ago when I was diagnosed with it. And as a person of fitness, that freaked me out because I'm like doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, you know, to keep that. So coming to find out that it's actually hereditary and all that. So this morning I woke up and I've been on medication, kind of a low dose, and it was a little bit high. And I was like, oh, you know, what's going on with me? After listening to your sermon, I took it again. My bottom number went from 103 to 83.
Whoa.
So let me tell you, just even not being in it, but visualizing it and really taking in what you had to say brought me a sense of calming. Like that was immediate.
Wow.
So hallelujah for that.
Thank you for sharing.
The other point that I wanted to bring out is that I don't know how many years it was between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, but I do remember somebody saying that what broke the silence was the cry of an infant in a manger, the word through his voice. So I thought that kind of spoke back to me about that. So thank you. Low blood pressure. Thanks for that.
Thank you for that, Jade. Again, thank you, Victoria. I just want to mention how I sent an email out a couple of days ago because my mother began hospice care this past Wednesday, and I listed some experiences that I've had in life, including some encounters with nature, and yet all of those encounters, I mean, they are their standard for transcendental experience for me, but I used all of that to point out how connecting with my mother has even gone beyond that. And I think that it's because of her roots, you know, being born and raised in a rural area, being, you know, on a tobacco plantation. I feel like I'm coming home when I'm in her presence, and I feel the presence of the Spirit, unlike any person that I have ever known in any setting. I can rely on that in her. So yeah, I mean, thank you, Jade, for that, because you know, people can lower your blood pressure, but they can also raise it. Anyway, Roy is going to lead us in communion as we prepare to close our time together.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm taken that this one of the central acts of the church, one of the central metaphors, is that we gather at table together and we share as community in communion with each other, that it requires that connection. And in that act, Jesus took the bread and he broke it and said, "This bread is my body broken for you. All of you, take it. And whenever you come together around a table, Share this bread that I might be remembered. Take and eat. After supper, he took the cup and said, "This cup is the cup of the new covenant in my blood poured out for you. Take it and drink." Let us pray. We are thankful, our God, that you call us together in conversation with each other, with all of your creation, and with you. We thank you that as we move forward into this week, that opportunity presents itself again and again and again. And in that conversation, we both find ourselves and we find you.